Imagine this. It's 1936. A man carrying a clipboard walks up the path to a small white church on a hill. He's not there for worship. He's there to count. He asks questions about members, children, finances, and the building itself. The answers are carefully written down. Then he leaves. No one ever comes back. At the time, nobody realized that afternoon would become the last complete snapshot of the American church. Today, nearly 90 years later, a 17-year-old with questions about God isn't walking up a church path. He's opening an AI chatbot at 1 o'clock in the morning. That single change tells us an incredible story, not just about church, about culture. Today, we're going to follow one family across 4 generations to understand how America quietly changed and where it might be heading next. Meet Walter. Walter isn't a real person. He's a composite build from the research, but his story represents millions of Americans. Church wasn't an event in Walter's life. It was a rhythm of his life. He didn't choose a church. He inherited one. 4 gatherings every week. Everyone knew his name. The church was where births were celebrated, meals were shared, funerals were held, and life happened. That's the world captured in 1936. From here, everything begins to change. When we picture the American church, most of us imagine the 1950s. Packed pews, growing Sunday schools, new buildings. But here's something surprising. That wasn't the normal state of the church. It was history's perfect storm. Millions returning from war, families exploding in size. Entire suburbs appeared almost overnight. Churches didn't create the wave, they rode it. And for decades, we've mistaken the peak for the baseline. If Walter could have walked into an American church in the 1970s, he probably would have been confused. Not because people had stopped believing, because church suddenly looked completely different. The organ was disappearing, a guitar appeared at the front, people were raising their hands, the language became more relaxed, services became shorter, less formal, more personal. To some people, it felt exciting. To others, it felt like everything sacred was being lost. But underneath all those arguments about music was something much bigger. People weren't really arguing about guitars. They were arguing about what church was supposed to be. Then something else happened. Church stopped being something you inherited and became something you chose. That was a huge cultural shift. Walter never church stopped. His parents were Methodist. His parents' parents were Methodist. That was simply who they were. But now people started asking questions. Do I like the preaching? Do my kids enjoy the youth group? How's the music? Is there good parking? Those questions would have sounded strange to Walter because the church had slowly entered the marketplace. And once that happened, competition began. Some churches grew incredibly quickly. They invested in children's ministries, better music, better facilities, professional communication. By the year 2000, the megachurch had become one of the defining features of the American Christianity. For millions of people, that was genuinely a blessing. People met Christ. Families found community. Lives were changed. That's important to acknowledge. But every success creates a trade-off. As churches became known for their worship style, or their pastor, or their programs, something quietly faded into the background. Denominations. The label on the church stopped. What mattered was the experience inside. Americans had moved from inheriting churches to choosing churches, building churches around personalities. That wasn't necessarily good or bad, but it was profoundly different, and that difference would matter later. Then something happened that looked at first glance like decline. Small churches began closing. Larger churches kept growing. If you only looked at the headlines, you might think America was simply becoming less religious. But I don't think that's the whole story. Something more interesting was happening. Imagine your local high street. Years ago, every neighborhood had its own little bookshop, its own hardware store, its own grocer. Then came the big retailers, and later, the internet. Those little shops didn't all disappear because people stopped buying books. Many disappeared because people started buying them somewhere else. I think something similar happened to churches. The smaller congregations struggled to survive. The larger ones became even larger. The middle slowly disappeared. Researchers sometimes call this consolidation. I prefer another word, sorting. People weren't necessarily leaving faith. They were relocating. The problem is, numbers don't tell the whole story. Around 19 people attended this little country church. The building closes. 11 of them start attending a large church 20 minutes away. On paper, almost nothing has changed. Attendance looks almost identical, but something has been lost. The little church knew everyone's name. People noticed if you were missing on a Sunday. Someone brought meals when you were sick. Children grew up together. 3 generations worshipped in the same room. Those things are incredibly difficult to measure, but they're often the things people miss most. That's why so many people say, church doesn't feel the same anymore. It isn't only because attendance changed, it's because relationship changed. The church didn't simply become smaller, it became bigger and further away, more efficient, more professional, but often less local. That's an important distinction, because it helps explain why the next generation experienced church so differently from the one before. And by the time artificial intelligence arrived, the foundations had already shifted. Every story has a moment where everything changes. For America, I think that moment came in 2020. Not because churches closed their doors, because almost overnight every church became a broadcaster. Pastors who had spent decades preaching to people suddenly found themselves preaching to cameras. Congregations gathered around televisions, laptops, and phones. And when the buildings reopened, something had changed. The live stream didn't disappear. Digital giving stayed. Online Bible stayed. Online Bible studies stayed. Hybrid church became normal. At first, it seemed like a temporary adjustment, but it wasn't. It changed people's expectations. If I can watch church from my sofa, why drive 20 minutes? If I can catch up later, why rearrange my Sunday? Technology hadn't replaced church, but it had quietly changed our relationship with it. And yet, right when many people assumed Christianity would continue shrinking forever, the data did something unexpected. It stopped falling, not dramatically, not with a great revival, just it stopped. For decades, every graph pointed in one direction, down. Then, almost without noticing, the line flattened. That's not the same as growth, but it's also not decline. Something had stabilized. And then another surprise arrived. Bible sales began climbing. Young adults started buying Bibles again. Not because someone told them to, but because they chose to. Among the most surprising trend was young men. For years, they had been drifting away from religion faster than almost anyone else. Then suddenly, that trend began to reverse. No one understands why. Loneliness, meaning, uncertainty, a reaction to modern culture, perhaps all of those things. But whatever the reason, the story wasn't over. In fact, it felt as though a new chapter was just beginning. Let's pause the story for just a moment. If Walter could stand beside us today, what would he notice? He'd notice there are fewer people in churches that were on his day. He'd notice churches are much larger. People travel further. Pastors carry a heavier burden. Communities are less connected. And loyalty in institutions isn't what it once was. And I think Walter would begin by counting any of these things. I think he'd ask a different question. Where do people go when life falls apart? Because that's really what church has always been. Not just places that hold services, places that hold people. Think about the biggest moments in life. Birth, marriage, loss, illness, hope, fear. For most of Walter's life, the church stood quietly in the middle of all of them. Today, we have more information than any generation in history. More podcasts, more sermons, more books, more videos, more opinions. But having more information doesn't necessarily mean we have more wisdom. In fact, many people would say the opposite. We're connected to everyone, yet loneliness has become one of the defining experiences of modern life. That's why I think this isn't really a story about church attendance. It's a story about where our culture now looks for meaning. Because when that changes, everything else changes with it. And that brings us to something Walter would never have imagined, a machine that could answer almost any question in seconds. History usually moves slowly. The printing press took generations to reshape Europe. Radio took decades. Television took decades. Even the internet unfolded over 20 or 30 years. Churches had time to react. Sometimes they reacted well, sometimes badly. But there was time. Artificial intelligence feels different, not because it's replacing God, not because it's replacing churches, because it's changing habits faster than any technology we've seen before. Think about how quickly AI has become part of everyday life. Students use it, lawyers use it, doctors use it, businesses use it, families use it. Millions of people ask AI questions every single day without giving it a second thought. That's why I think the years between now and 2030 matter so much. Not because everything will be decided then, but because habits become normal remarkably quickly. Once people discover a new way of doing something, they rarely go back. The church had faced technology revolutions before: printing, radio, television, the internet. It survived every one of them. But each time, the technology changed the culture first. Only later did the church realize what had happened. My question isn't whether the church will survive AI. I think it will. My question is, what kind of church will emerge on the other side? Because if we're asking the wrong questions today, we may spend the next decade solving yesterday's problems. I think that's the real hinge. So let's go back to our family. Walter worked with his hands. He built houses. His daughter Ruth lived through one of the greatest periods of prosperity America had ever known. Her son David helped build a successful church during decades when the middle class was growing. Each generation assumed something simple. If you worked hard, next year would probably be a little better than this year. That assumption shaped churches more than you realize. Because churches didn't exist outside the economy. They existed inside it. The churches that flourished over the last 50 years were built around a growing professional middle class. Teachers, engineers, office workers, managers, small business owners, families with stable incomes, people who could give consistently, volunteer consistently, plan consistently. But what happens if that foundations began to shift? Artificial intelligence isn't replacing every job, at least not today. It's changing the jobs people begin with. Think about the kind of work AI already does well: writing reports, research, bookkeeping, basic legal work, administrative tasks, customer support, coding. Those aren't just jobs. They're only the first rung on someone's career ladder. If the first rung disappears, how do you climb? That's why I don't think the biggest question is whether AI takes jobs. The bigger question is whether it changes confidence. Because people who feel uncertain about tomorrow spend differently today. They give differently. They volunteer differently. They make different decisions about family, about community, and about church. For decades, churches assumed the economic ground beneath them was solid. What if over the next 10 years, it isn't? That's not a prediction. It's simply the question we have to be willing to ask. Now think about Eli. He's 17. He has a question about God, not a theological debate, a real question. Maybe he's wondering whether God could ever forgive something he's done. Maybe he's struggling with anxiety. Maybe he's reading a passage in the Bible he doesn't understand. Walter wouldn't have asked the pastor. David probably would have phoned someone from church. Eli reached for his phone, and within seconds he has an answer. It's thoughtful, patient, always available. It doesn't seem embarrassed by difficult questions, and it never tells him to come back tomorrow. Now, let's be clear. AI isn't a pastor. It doesn't pray. It doesn't know Eli. It doesn't sit beside him in hospital. It can't baptize him. It can't hug him at his father's funeral. But it can answer questions. And that matters. Because every question that used to begin a relationship with another human being now begins with a machine. That's a profound cultural shift. Not because the answers are always better, but because the habit has changed. For generations, churches focused on teaching people what to believe. The next generation may need just as much help learning who to trust. And perhaps even more importantly, why? Because wisdom has never been about having answers. It's about knowing which voices deserve to shape your life. There's one more shift that fascinates me. For years, churches believed excellence would help people. Better lighting, better cameras, better music, better graphics, better productions. And to be fair, that approach made sense. People compared churches to television, to concerts, to professional media. So churches tried to keep up. But AI changes the question because suddenly, beautiful graphics are easy. Professional videos are easy. Perfect voices are easy. Even entire songs can be generated in minutes. When excellence becomes almost free, it stops being remarkable. Think about handwritten letters. They're not valuable because they're perfectly written. They're valuable because someone took the time. The imperfections are the point. I wonder if church is entering a similar moment. A generation raised on AI-generated content isn't asking, "Can you impress me?" They're asking, "Can I trust you?" That's a big difference. People can sense when something is polished, but they can also sense when something is genuine. Maybe that's why some young people are beginning to look for older traditions, silence, liturgy, communion, places where nothing feels manufactured. Not because they're rejecting technology, but because they're hungry for something technology can't produce. And perhaps that's the opportunity, not to compete with AI, but to offer what AI never can: presence, truth spoken face to face, friendship, forgiveness, a shared meal, a community that actually knows your name. These things have suddenly become rare, and whatever something becomes rare, it becomes valuable. Every generation has something that's difficult to find. For most of human history, it was information. If you wanted to learn from a great teacher, you had to be in that room. If you wanted wisdom, you had to spend years finding someone who had it. Books were expensive. Education was rare. Knowledge itself was precious. That's the world Walter lived in. But that's not our world. Today, almost every piece of human knowledge sits into the device in your pocket. And now, with artificial intelligence, that information just doesn't sit there waiting to be found. It talks back. It explains. It summarizes. It translates. It teaches. Knowledge has become abundant. And whenever something becomes abundant, its value changes. Think about clean water. In a desert, it's priceless. In your kitchen tap, you barely think about it. Economics has always worked that way. Value follows scarcity. So here's the question that keeps coming back to me. If intelligence is becoming abundant, what is becoming scarce? I don't think the answer is information. I think it's meaning, belonging, presence, a place where someone knows your story, someone who notices when you don't show up, someone who tells you the truth because they love you, not because an algorithm predicted you'd like to hear it. That's what Eli is searching for. When he bought the Bible, he wasn't looking for information. He always had unlimited information. He was looking for something information alone couldn't give him. Purpose, hope, a reason to keep going. And maybe that's why we're seeing something that surprised almost everyone. Young people buying Bibles again, questions about faith returning, not because they've run out of technology, but because they've discovered technology can't answer every question. Artificial intelligence can explain what forgiveness means. It can't forgive you. It can describe love. It can't love you. It can tell you about community. It can't become your community. That's the difference. And I think it's where the greatest opportunity for the new church lies. Not in competing with machines, but in becoming more deeply human. Because the things technology can't manufacture are becoming the things our culture needs most. So, where does all this lead? No one knows the future, but I think there are three realistic possibilities. The first is that church simply becomes more efficient. Artificial intelligence writes the newsletters, helps prepare sermons, answers emails, creates graphics, schedules volunteers. Everything becomes faster, cheaper, more streamlined. Church survives, but not much really changes. The second possibility is consolidation. Large churches become even larger. Smaller churches continue to disappear. Technology allows one church to reach multiple campuses, multiple cities, perhaps even multiple countries. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Many lives can still be changed. But we should also ask what gets lost along the way. Then there's the third possibility, and it's the one I find most exciting. Not because it's easy, because it feels strangely familiar. Imagine fewer people gathering in huge auditoriums and more gathering around dinner tables. Imagine churches measured less by seating capacity and more by how deeply people know one another. Imagine buildings becoming training centers while ministries happen in homes, cafes, workplaces, and neighborhoods. In many ways, that isn't a new idea at all. It's one of the oldest ideas Christianity has. The early church didn't begin with impressive buildings. It began around tables. Perhaps the future isn't about inventing something new. Perhaps it's about remembering something old. If that's true, what might the next decade look like? I think churches will become lighter, smaller, more connected, less dependent on buildings, less dependent on personalities, more dependent on relationships. I think pastors will increasingly see themselves as equipping people rather than doing everything themselves. I think we'll rediscover the value of ordinary Christians leading ordinary communities. And here's an unexpected prediction. I think analog experiences will become more valuable. Paper Bibles, shared meals, phone-free conversations, singing together, silence. Things that once felt old-fashioned may soon feel refreshingly authentic. Because in a world filled with artificial experiences, the real thing stands out. Not because it's louder, because it's genuine. History has a funny way of doing that. Sometimes progress doesn't erase the past. It reminds us why the past mattered. Let's finish where we began. Back on that little hill in 1936. The census worker packed away his clipboard. He walked back down the path. He had no idea he was recording the end of an era. Walter didn't know it either. He simply kept living his life. He worshipped, he served, he raised his family, he loved his neighbors. And somehow, through 4 generations, the story brings us here, to Eli, a young man living in a world Walter could never have imagined, a world of artificial intelligence, infinite information, constant connection, and yet the deepest human questions haven't changed at all. Who am I? Why am I here? Can I be forgiven? Does anyone really know me? Technology has transformed almost everything, but it hasn't transformed those questions, and I don't think it ever will. Maybe that's why I'm hopeful. Not because I think the church will go back to the 1950s. It won't. Not because I think artificial intelligence is going away. It isn't. I'm hopeful because every major change in history forces us to rediscover what matters most. For a long time, the church has been tempted to compete on things the world can now produce faster, cheaper, and at an enormous scale. But there are things no machine can create. A hand held at a hospital bedside, a meal shared with friends, someone praying with you when life falls apart, a community that remembers your children's names, a table where everyone is welcome. Those things have always been the true strength of the church. Not buildings, not programs, not production, people, loving people. Perhaps that's what the next chapter is really about. Not saving an institution, but rediscovering a community. The man with the clipboard never came back. No one will ever produce another perfect snapshot of this moment in history. The question isn't how future generations will measure us. The question is whether they'll remember us. Not for our buildings, not for our technology, but because when they needed hope, someone sat down beside them. Someone broke bread with them. Someone pointed them to Jesus. And perhaps in an age of artificial intelligence, the simple act of being fully present will become the most extraordinary witness the church has ever offered. Thank you for watching.